Welcome back to 1834. This is match 5, game number 2. The last game was a draw, so the score is still 0-0, and McDonald is playing as white again. Today's guest commentator is Cassandra, the cat in a tinfoil hat. Let's begin. McDonald starts with e4, we have e5, and they continue to play the same opening as they did last time. Knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, bishop to c5, and b4, the Evans Gambit. And as everybody knows, all gentlemen must accept a gambit, and Labordonnais accepts. We have c3 now, and last time, and in most of the previous Evans Gambits they've played, Labordonnais retreated to a5. This time he tries something that they've never done before. Bishop to c5, and Labordonnais says, "I bet you did not expect that." McDonald replies, "I don't care, your bishop's just going to end up on b6 anyway, like before, I'm just going to castle." Labordonnais says, "Fair enough," and he goes back to b6. We have d4 with a pawn exchange in the centre now, and d6, we have h3, h6, and they're still playing the same moves as they did last time, except for the transposition with the bishop. And at this point, McDonald previously went knight to c3 and then bishop to b2, but this time he plays bishop to b2 first. Previously, Labordonnais played knight to e7, but this time he puts his queen there instead, and we're in completely new territory. Cassandra says knight to f6 would have been better than either move, and did you know they're turning the frog's-gay? Also, rook to e1 would be good here for McDonald, but instead he plays e5. So Labordonnais captures the pawn here, and again Cassandra has a nice continuation for McDonald, and that's to push the d-pawn to threaten the knight. And we'll just go through a quick example line here to see what might happen. If you save your knight on a5, the white knight is going to capture the pawn in the centre. The black queen can't capture this because the rook is coming over to pin it against the king, and the queen will be lost. So you might want to get one of the pieces off the back rank to try to castle out of danger. But here, you're just going to push the pawn, and after the pawn captures, you capture the bishop, the queen captures back, and now this bishop snipes the g-pawn from the corner, threatens the rook, so you're going to move the rook out the way, but now the white rook is coming over to e1 and giving a check, and there's all sorts of threats here going on, so very nice for McDonald. But Epstein didn't kill himself, and instead McDonald played bishop to a3 to attack the queen. So the queen gets out of the way to f6. So from here, McDonald gets the rook to e1 move in, lining up in front of the king, and one idea for Labordonnais might be to develop his second knight to e7, adding an extra barrier between the rook and the king. But instead he plays his bishop to d7, and maybe he's doing this because he's intending to castle on the queen side. Again, maybe McDonald should think about developing his second knight, maybe to c3, but instead he decides to capture the pawn in the centre. Now here, this is threatening the queen, and that would come with check, so Labordonnais simply gets out of the way to f5. We have the knight to c3 move now, and indeed Labordonnais does castle on the queen side. You can see that suddenly the rook is threatening the queen, should the bishop move, and you can also see that now he has a majority of pawns on the queen side here, looking like they might come into play later on in the game. From here, McDonald plays his knight up to d5, and now he has a horse on Labordonnais' side of the board, and that's not going to be very comfortable for Labordonnais. He's going to want to do something about it. He tries bishop to e6 to try to chase it away, but of course McDonald is not going to move this knight. If he does, he's going to lose his queen. Instead, he thinks he's spotted something. Maybe he's seen further into the future than Labordonnais this time. Let's see what he does. He plays bishop to d3 to attack the queen. From here, Labordonnais doesn't try to defend it or move it away. He instead captures the knight in the centre with the rook, because he knows that if McDonald captures the queen here, which he does, the rook is going to capture the white queen, which it does, and from here McDonald captures the bishop, which comes with check, so the pawn captures back. The rook captures the d1 rook, and now the knight finally develops itself to e7. And after all of that, all of those crazy exchanges, McDonald is just about winning on material, so well done him. He's down the gambit pawn still, but he has a rook for a knight. We'll see how this works out for them both. McDonald continues the game with a rook lift to d3, defending the undefended bishop, and Labordonnais plays knight to d5, perhaps thinking of coming over to f4, but McDonald blocks it with his pawn. We have g5, and now king to g2, and the rook comes across to line up in front of the king. McDonald lifts his other rook now to e4, perhaps trying to defend the squares in front of the king, and Labordonnais plays a5. Perhaps he's trying to get his queenside pawns on the roll, since he has a majority over here. He might be able to overwhelm McDonald down down the wing. We have knight back to e1 and now knight on c to b4, offering an exchange of pieces, which McDonald is quite happy to accept. The pawn captures back here and McDonald pushes his a pawn, so Labordne captures it and the rook captures on a3. Labordne decides it's time to start advancing his king. It's looking a little bit more endgame-ish. He wants to assist his pawns up the side of the board. Meanwhile, McDonald brings his rook over to f3. He's looking for the undefended f7 square. Labordne doesn't mind for now. He just pushes c5 and gets his passed pawns rolling. Rook to f7 with check as expected, and the king just tucks up nicely on the c6 square in the midst of all his pawns. McDonald starts chasing the other pawns on the h-file. He gets up behind it. It's undefended, so Labordne defends. We have h4 and we have a pawn exchange on the wing. You'll notice now that there's nothing that Labordne can do to save his remaining h-pawn from the two rooks, so he leaves it alone and plays bishop to a5 instead to attack the white knight. This move also allows the b-pawn to get past. McDonald saves his knight, knight to f3, and Labordne goes knight to c7. Of course, here McDonald captures the pawn, recapturing the gambited pawn from earlier. They are now equal with 3 pawns each. Labordne does not want to exchange rooks here. He needs to keep the material on the table, so he brings it back to g7. Here, McDonald decides he needs to bring the king around to try to get to a more central position, maybe to try to stop the pawns advancing. So he starts out with king to f1, and we have b5 from Labordne really getting going now. King to e2 from McDonald, and now king to d5 from Labordne. Rook to h7, offering a rook exchange, but of course Labordne still does not want to accept this, so he gets out of the way. But this allows the rook to come across to d7, which comes with check. So the king goes to c6, threatens the rook, but this just allows the rook to come forward to d7, protected by the pawn, which is check again. So once more, the king retreats to b7. And now McDonald comes in with his other rook to h7 and pins the knight. You can see that the rook is attacking the pawn here and the knight's notionally defending it, but it's not really. It can't move because of the pin. So what does Labordne do? Well, he says, you can have my pawn, I'm just going to push b4. However, McDonald, with his all-seeing eye, realizes that if he does take this, the b pawn is going to advance very quickly down the table. He's not going to be able to catch it. He will be able to block it with a knight, but it's going to be looking very dangerous. So he decides that instead of capturing the pawn here, he's going to bring the knight over in advance to keep an eye on these pawns. From here, Labordne decides that he is going to give up this pawn, and he brings his rook over to a8 to try to make something out of his remaining ones, and McDonald does indeed capture the pawn here. McDonald now has 3 passed pawns to Labordne's 2. Labordne plays his bishop back next to the king, which allows the rook more scope down the side of the board, and McDonald plays knight to c4 and gets a double attack upon the black bishop. Labordne ignores this for now and brings his rook down for a check on a2, so the king moves up to d3, where it's defending the knight, but he has left the defense of the backwards pawn here. However, Labordne doesn't have enough time to do anything about this because he's got to deal with the attack upon the bishop. So the bishop goes back to a7 and McDonald brings his rook across to f6 to defend the pawn, but also to allow the e-pawn past. Rook to a1 from Labordne. He looks like he's heading towards the e1 square to try to catch up with the pawn, but McDonald just pushes it. Rook to e1 as expected, but McDonald keeps pushing the pawn. These rooks are providing some very nice cover for it as it advances, although the knight is defending the queening square along with the rook. Labordne tries pushing his pawn now to b3, but Cassandra says that McDonald now has a force mate in 12 and they're lying when they say it's safe and effective, but nobody believes her. We have knight to a5 with check now. It's forking the pawn here. So the king goes up to c8. Rook to f8 with check from McDonald now, and you can see that Labordne is in big trouble. The rook's covering the entire back rank. You can't retreat to b7 because of the knight, and if you come here, it's going to be checkmate very swiftly because as you queen, it's revealing a check from the rook as well as the check from the queen. You're going to have to move the king somewhere, and the only square is d6, and you're just getting checkmated very nicely like this. So the only move for Labordne in this position is to block with the knight, and of course you're just losing the knight with check, and that is actually what happens. So the king comes forward to c7, and here we have knight captures on b3. Cassandra says that although McDonald is still winning by a lot, perhaps a better move in this position was rook to a8. You can see the bishop is under attack, but should you try to save it, you're getting checkmated by a promoting knight. Look at that, it's awesome. The two rooks are covering the two back ranks. The knight's checking the king whilst covering this square, and the remaining knight is covering the remaining square. So just an awesome, awesome checkmate. So you can't save your bishop here. If instead you did some random move like pushing your pawn to b2, then again the white pawn is promoting to a knight. It's a double check on the king here, and the only move for the king is b6. And in that case, you're getting checked with the rook here. It's protected by the knight, so you can't capture it with the king. But you are giving up the knight in order to gain the checkmate like this. So again, a great checkmate. Maybe not as awesome as the previous one, but still right up there. So the only plan for Labordne in this position is in fact to delay things by pushing c4 and giving a check. In this case it's going to take Macdonald a little bit longer, but there's not going to be anything to stop this pawn from queening and from him winning the game eventually. Also, have you heard about election fortification? But it's no good, because in this position Labordne was not listening. He's quite aware that the game is over and he resigned the game. So well done, Macdonald. He goes up 1-0, off to a great start in this fifth match. I'll see you again next time.